The August heat pressed down on Bitterroot Valley like a hand flat against the back of the neck. Clara Bergman was already 2.5 meters underground. She had been there since before sunrise, working by the light of a single tallow candle. The flame barely moved. That was the point. 2.5 meters below the surface, the air had no interest in the season happening above it. It held its own temperature, its own stillness, its own logic. It stayed at about 4 degrees Celsius, not cold enough to freeze, not warm enough to rot. The space between those two facts was where food survived. Clara had spent the better part of 3 weeks making sure that space was exactly right. She dug the cellar herself. It ran almost 3 meters north to south, just over 2 meters east to west. She used a spade and a pickaxe for the hard spots. Her late husband had rigged a rope and pulley system years ago to pull fence posts. She repurposed it. She hauled the excavated earth up through the hatch in the cabin floor, 2 canvas buckets at a time. She dumped the loads at the edge of the tree line. That way, the spring melt would not wash the earth back toward the cabin's foundation. Clara thought about the spring melt in August. She thought about everything ahead of when it became necessary. This habit had followed her from a different part of the country, from a different version of her life. She had never found a reason to let it go. That morning, she was setting crates. Rough pine boxes. The Hester brothers built them for her in June. Each one had the same dimensions. Each one had a 1.25 centimeters gap beneath the bottom slats. This allowed air to pass under the stored goods. She lowered them one by one using the rope. She climbed down the ladder to position each crate precisely. Then she climbed back up for the next. Potatoes went first. They needed the coolest section, the north corner. The ground held temperature best there. Then came the turnips. After that, the dried beans she had put up in sealed crocks. The onions were braided and hung from the ceiling joists on lengths of twine. They did not touch the walls. They did not touch each other. Each one got its own small radius of dry air. She did not work quickly. Speed in a cellar produced mistakes. Mistakes underground were harder to find than mistakes at the surface. A misplaced crate could block the airflow. One rotten potato pressing against a good one could ruin a dozen more. That could happen long before the smell ever reached the living quarters above. She learned this not from a book, but from watching her mother work. Before that, her grandmother. She had watched them from the year she was old enough to understand why the work was done the way it was done, and not some faster, easier way. She heard the horse then. She was on her knees in the north corner. She was pressing a thumbnail into the flesh of each potato before she set it down. Firm, unbroken skin, no soft spots, no gray beneath the surface. She checked each one like a doctor checks a pulse, not looking for good news but for accurate information. The horse stopped right above her. She heard the creak of saddle leather. The rider held his position. He did not dismount. She kept working. Thomas Hale's voice came down through the open hatch. The distance flattened it. "What exactly are you doing down there?" Clara set the potato she was holding into the crate. She reached for another. "Storing." "In the ground?" "Yes. It is August. I know what month it is." He shifted in the saddle. She could hear it. Thomas Hale was not a man who sat still when he had something to say. He always had something to say. He had ranched this valley for 20 years. He came over from the eastern part of the state with his wife, Margaret, and nothing else. He built what he had from weather and stubbornness. He had a practical intelligence Clara genuinely respected, even when it was pointed in the wrong direction. "My wife says you have been buying from every farm in the valley," he said. "She says you cleaned out the Doyle family's potato storage last week. I paid their full asking price. I left them enough seed for the fall planting." They were not complaining. They were not, no, but people are noticing. A pause. "You have been drying meat since June. That is what the Marsh boy told my wife. Said he could smell it coming from your property 3 fields over." Clara finished the potato row. She moved to the next. "The Marsh boy has a good nose." "You have 4 pigs." "I do not have 4 pigs anymore. I have 12 chickens, 40 acres of root crops, and the better part of a season's worth of dried goods. I have a cellar that will keep all of it between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius from now until next June." She said it without turning around. Her voice stayed conversational. "The pigs I converted in June. Pork dries well. Pork keeps. Live pigs need feed. I would rather put that feed towards something that will still be useful in February." Silence from above. She could imagine the expression on his face. Not malicious, not unkind. It was the specific look of a man who has made a judgment and is now recalculating it without wanting to show he is recalculating it. Thomas Hale was proud, but he was not dishonest. The distinction mattered. For one person, he finally said, "Yes, you are putting up stores for one winter. One person, and you have already, 180 kilograms down there? 195 kilograms. I will have it to 225 by the end of the month." The silence that followed was different. The first silence had been recalculation. This one was closer to genuine bewilderment. "That is excessive." Clara stood. She pressed a hand to the small of her back. The bending had made itself felt. She looked up at the rectangle of blue sky framed by the open hatch. Thomas Hale's boot was visible at the edge. "Excessive is a guess," she told him. 225 kilograms is a number. She did not explain further. She climbed the ladder. She stepped out of the hatch into the August heat. It hit her the way it always did when she surfaced, like a curtain being pulled aside to reveal a room everyone else was living in, and she had only visited briefly. She brushed the dirt from her hands. She looked at him directly. He was a large man, Thomas Hale, broad across the chest. Years of weather had made his face look permanent, not aged. He was looking at her cellar hatch, the way a person looks at something they cannot find the proper category for. "My father stored for winter," he said. 225 kilograms for winter. But not like this. Not one person alone, 225 kilograms. Your father was a smart man. He never put up more than the family needed. Clara looked at him steadily. How did he know what the family needed? Thomas opened his mouth. He closed it. The answer was obvious. You made a reasonable estimate based on past experience. You stored enough, not more. Enough was what people stored. Enough was how everyone thought about it. The system had worked well enough for long enough that there was no obvious reason to think about it differently. He guessed right, Thomas said. He guessed, and he guessed right. Clara picked up the rope she had left coiled beside the hatch. Guessing right is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as having enough room for being wrong. Thomas looked at her a moment longer. He turned his horse. Before he rode off, he said, I hope you enjoy your vegetables, Clara. He meant it as a small joke, the kind that gentles an argument into something less than an argument. But the word hope landed in the morning air. It sat there. Clara noticed it the way she noticed everything she stored, for what it revealed rather than what it intended. She lowered herself back into the cellar. She reached for the next crate. Clara had grown up on the edge of winter, not the kind they had in Montana. Not the clean, sharp, dramatic winters newcomers to the territory talked about, like they were the first ones to survive it. The winters Clara knew were from northern Minnesota, in the lake country. They were not dramatic. They were patient. They would settle into the land in October. They never rushed themselves, and they did not care what the calendar said when they finally decided to leave. People who lived there understood this. They knew it like gravity. It was not a fact you had to remember. It was something your body already knew. Your habits were built around it. Her father was a timberman. Swedish stock, third generation on American soil. His hands were never entirely clean. His mind was always a season ahead of where he stood. He built the family's root cellar the summer Clara turned 6. She remembered watching him pace out the dimensions in the yard. He measured depth with a rod he had cut to mark the frost line. Then he went 60 centimeters deeper than that. She asked him why the 2 extra feet. The frost line was already marked. He crouched down to her level. Because the frost line is where the average winter ends, he said. And I do not store food for average winters. I store food for the one that has not happened yet. Clara was 25 years old when she understood what he meant. That understanding came the way hard understanding always comes. It was not an idea. It was an event. The winter of 1869 was not exceptional in northern Minnesota, not by any measure that would have made it into a record book. It arrived on time. It proceeded more or less as expected through January and February. Then, in mid-March, it simply failed to end. It was not violent. No blizzards. No record cold. It just declined to release the ground. Temperatures stayed below freezing through the 3rd week of March, then the 4th, then into April. People adjusted. They always did. They met inconvenience with patience. They had confidence that tomorrow would be different. Aldridge, their neighbor, had farmed the parcel to the east for 15 years. He had never had serious trouble. He calculated his stores like most careful farmers did. Enough to get through a normal winter, plus a reasonable margin. By the end of March, he had used his reasonable margin. By the first week of April, he made the decision most people in his position would make. He cut portions. He rationed what remained. He told himself the same thing the entire valley was saying. It would end soon. It always ended. This was just a long winter. Not an impossible one. It did not end soon enough. Clara's father stood at Aldridge's graveside in mid-April. The ground was still frozen, not soft enough for a proper burial. The minister said appropriate things. Her father said nothing at the graveside. He said nothing on the walk home. When they were back inside, her mother putting the younger children to bed, he sat at the kitchen table. His coffee grew cold. He looked at a point somewhere between the table surface and whatever he was seeing in his memory. Finally, he spoke. Not loudly, no drama, just a fact he filed away. He trusted the calendar. Winter does not read the calendar. Clara was a grown woman before she told anyone that story. Not because she was ashamed. It was not painful. It was neither. It was just not the kind of story that needed telling twice. It only needed to be remembered. She remembered it. She remembered it through every decision she made about cold weather, about distance, about the difference between what had happened before and what might happen next. She came to Montana in 1879 with her husband, Eric. He was a quiet man. He had a gift for machinery. No gift at all for the particular cruelty of bacteria. He died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1884. He left Clara 40 acres, a cabin that needed 2 new roof sections, 4 pigs, 12 chickens, and the mercury thermometer he had used to watch his failing temperature in the final weeks of his illness. She kept the thermometer. She buried her husband. She repaired the roof. She replanted the next spring. She did not leave. By 1891, she had been alone on that land for 7 years. Not lonely. Alone is not the same as lonely. But she was shaped by a particular discipline. It comes from knowing that no other person's judgment stands between you and the consequences of your own. Every decision returned to her, its own author. Every mistake was hers to absorb. That discipline made her precise in ways that could look, from the outside, like something colder than it was. The thermometer became something different in her hands than it had been in Eric's. He used it for illness. She used it for the earth. Every morning from mid-June through mid-October, before she made coffee, before she did anything else, she walked to the east side of the cabin. She had sunk an iron pipe there, 45 centimeters deep. She lowered the thermometer down into it. She held it there for 3 full minutes. She used the watch she kept on a nail by the door. Then she pulled it out. She read the number. She entered it in a journal she kept for this purpose alone. Not the household journal, not the farming ledger. A separate, narrow notebook. She had started it in the spring of 1885. She had been filling it in every year since. 6 years of soil temperatures, 1 reading per day, all the way through the first freeze. Most years, the pattern was consistent enough. June would see the soil warming from the spring runoff. It would hit its summer peak by late July. It would begin its slow decline through August as the surface air temperatures started their own retreat. In a normal year, the readings formed a shape on the page you could almost predict. A rise, a plateau, a measured fall, arriving within a few degrees of where they had been the year before and the year before that. The summer of 1891 was not doing that. The July readings had been low, not dramatically, but consistently. The kind of lowness that on any single morning you would dismiss as a cool night carrying over. But across 3 weeks of entries, it became something else, a pattern, a deviation from the pattern inside the pattern. By the first week of August, the soil at 45 centimeters was running 2 degrees Celsius below the equivalent readings from the same period in 1889 and 1890. 2 degrees Celsius does not sound like much, but in soil temperature, in the context of what that soil has to give back to the air above it through autumn, 4 degrees is a significant number. It meant the earth went into summer cold. It meant the summer had not been long enough or warm enough to rebuild what the previous winter drew out. It meant that when the next cold season came, looking for warmth to take, it would find the ground already partway there. Clara had not told Thomas Hale any of this. There was no particular reason to hide it, but there was also no particular point in sharing a series of numbers with someone who had no framework in which to place them. The numbers meant something to her. She had spent 6 years building the context that made them mean something. Presented without that context, they were just numbers, and numbers without context do not convince people of anything. They just sound like an argument someone is trying to win. September arrived in the Bitterroot Valley. It came in golden and unhurried, the way it always did. The people there moved through it with a comfortable ease, a competence born from years of doing this before. They expected to do it again. But Clara moved differently. Her neighbors noticed. Everyone else was selling their surplus, turning crops into cash or trade goods. Clara was buying. She turned her cash into storage. Not aggressively, not in a way that caused friction. She paid fair prices, sometimes even better than fair. But her transactions went in the opposite direction from everyone else. She bought 2 more wagon loads of mixed-root vegetables from the Hester family. They lived at the north end of the valley. Then she bought dried corn from the Doyle farm. Robert and Eleanor Doyle were good people, a family of 5 with 3 children under 10. They had a competence that made frontier life seem almost manageable. Eleanor told Clara she wished she had the space for the kind of storage Clara was building. Clara told her to think about it before next spring. Eleanor laughed. Clara had expected that. She said they would be fine. Clara also bought the last of the Marsh family's surplus grain. Raymond and Deborah Marsh were a smaller family, middle-aged. Their son, James, was 19. He had come back from 2 years working in the railroad camps further east sometime in late summer. James had the kind of physical confidence that came from hard labor. Nothing had tempered it yet. He was not unpleasant. He was simply young in the way that makes a person feel like they had already survived the worst of things, because the worst things they had seen so far had, in fact, been survivable. The Doyles and the Marshes, along with the rest of the 12 families, came to the valley's end-of-season gathering in late September. Clara knew them all well enough to have a clear picture of what they had as they faced winter: adequate supplies, practical experience, and the working assumption that the coming months would be much like the previous ones. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been correct every prior year. Clara sat at the edge of the gathering. She drank her coffee. She watched the children run between the tables in the last warm evening of the year. She did not correct anyone's assumption. What she knew was not more than what they knew. It was just oriented differently. And orientation is not something you can hand to a person at a social gathering in September. Thomas Hale found her as the evening wound down. He was at the edge of the firelight carrying a tin cup. He moved with the easy sociability of a man comfortable in his community. He sat beside her on the fence rail and looked out at the families. They were finishing their meals in the cooling air. "You did not bring anything to trade tonight," he said. "I did not have surplus to trade." "That is one way to put it," he said. He drank from his cup. "Margaret thinks you put yourself in a difficult position financially, buying all that produce. She worries about you. We both do, if I am honest." Clara looked at him. There was nothing theatrical in his face. Nothing put on. He genuinely meant it, the way a neighbor who had watched you through several seasons of Alone means it. "I appreciate that," she said. She did. "Tell her not to worry." Thomas looked across the gathering, at the Doyles, at the Marshes, at the Hester brothers, at all the faces lit up and relaxed in the way that end-of-harvest occasions allow. "Everyone is feeling good about where they are," he said. "Good humor, decent yields, yes. You think they should not be?" Clara watched Eleanor Doyle's youngest daughter chase a dog through the firelight. The child shrieked with the particular joy of someone who is warm and fed, someone who cannot conceive of the alternative. "I think feeling good is not the same as being ready," Clara said, "and I think those are 2 different things that can both be true at the same time." Thomas sat with that for a moment. Then he shook his head, not unkindly. He finished his coffee. He went to find his wife. By the 1st of October, Clara's cellar held 213 kilograms of food. She spent the next week adding to it, organizing the final sections, and doing the work most people overlooked. These were the small details that decided if her stored food would last. She rechecked every spot where the wooden frame met the earthen wall. She pressed her palm flat against each section. Clara felt for any cold air moving through. A draft meant heat loss. Heat loss meant the temperature would change, and changing temperatures meant spoilage. She found 2 small gaps in the northwest corner. She filled them with a mix of clay and dried grass, pressing it in tight. Then she ran her hand along the seam until no air passed through. Clara inspected the ladder rungs one by one. A broken rung, especially with full hands, was how accidents happened. She had no one to drive her to a doctor. She checked the hatch seal, a fitted pine frame she had sanded to close flush with the cabin floor. She ran beeswax along the inside edge to make the contact tighter. The floor above the cellar had a second layer of planking. An inch of sand sat between the 2 layers. This was thermal mass, a technique her father had taught her. The sand kept the temperature in the cellar from changing, with the variations happening in the cabin above. A fire burning in the hearth on a January night could raise the cabin floor temperature by 8 degrees Celsius. With the double plank and sand, that heat stayed in the cabin. The cellar stayed at 4 degrees Celsius. She hung the dried pork in the eastern section, away from the root vegetables. Each piece was wrapped in cloth, then in more cloth. She suspended them from iron hooks she had driven into the ceiling joists. 5.4 kilograms of pork hung from each hook. 8 hooks held 43.5 kilograms total from the 4 animals. She had rendered the fat separately into crocks. Fat did not dry, it solidified. This was its own kind of preservation. It also served 2 purposes, cooking medium and an emergency source of calories when nothing else was available. Her mother had kept a crock of rendered lard in the cellar every year of Clara's childhood. She never had to use it for anything beyond normal cooking. But the crocks were always there, always full. The point was never that you would certainly need it. The point was that you would certainly not need to worry about not having it. She finished the last inspection on October 14th. In her daily journal beneath the morning soil temperature reading, she wrote, "Cellar complete, 226 kilograms confirmed, hatch sealed. Temperature this morning, 4 degrees Celsius, ready." Then she put the journal away. She made herself a meal from what was in the cabin, not what was in the cellar. She went to bed before dark. She rarely did this. She had been working since before sunrise for almost 3 months. Her body had finally made the case that enough had been done. Thomas Hale returned once more before the first snow. This time he dismounted, which was different from his August visit. He tied his horse at the rail. He came to her door. He knocked with a knuckle rap that meant he was there on reasonable terms, not on any particular business. Clara opened the door and let him in without ceremony. He stood in her cabin. He looked at the floor, now closed. The second layer of planking was sealed, flush and featureless. There was no visible sign of what lay beneath it, only a slight plainness to the floor that had not been there before, a carefulness to its construction that was different from the rest of the cabin. "You finished it," he said. His voice carried something she had not heard before. Not admiration, not yet. Something closer to honest uncertainty. In a man like Thomas Hale, that was more meaningful than admiration would have been. Yes, 227 kilograms. He said it like a number he was testing for weight. For one winter, one person. 226 kilograms formally, Clara replied. I added a crock of rendered fat and a second jar of dried herbs after the final count. Call it 227. He looked at her. You could have sold a portion of this. Made your money back. Bought livestock, a cow at least. Expansion requires stability, Clara said. This creates the stability. He shook his head. It was not the dismissive shake from August. This was slower, more internal. He was thinking, not dismissing. You believe something is coming. I believe something has come before, Clara told him. Must. That is the only credential I trust. He stood in her cabin for another moment. He looked at the floor. He looked at the simple order of the room. Nothing excessive, nothing decorative. Everything occupied its space with a purpose that was clear without needing words. Then he nodded once. It was the specific nod of a man who had decided not to argue. A point he could not quite find the angle to argue. This was not the same as agreeing, but it was at least the same as stopping. He left. Clara stood at the window. She watched him ride north toward his own land. The valley stretched out on either side of the trail in its autumn colors. Amber and rust, the dark green of the pines held the ridgeline. It was beautiful. Land in October is always beautiful. It was beautiful in the way things are beautiful right before they become something harder. The snow arrived on November 8th. It was not a storm, just a covering, steady, windless. The kind of snow that builds up without anyone noticing. People woke to white without hearing a single flake fall. 5 centimeters blanketed the ground by dawn. Another 2.5 centimeters came by mid-morning. Then it stopped. The sky cleared to that pale, hard blue. It meant cold was here to stay, not just passing through. Clara walked outside at first light. She did not look at the snow. She went to the east side of her cabin and lowered the thermometer into the iron pipe. It sank 46 centimeters deep. She held it there for 3 full minutes. Her eyes scanned the sky, then the tree line. She listened to the specific silence that told her the wind had stopped. It was not just a pause. The wind had simply forgotten this valley for a while. She pulled out the thermometer. In the clear November light, it read -2 degrees Celsius. She went inside. She opened her journal. She wrote the date and the number. Below it, she added, arrival early, ground temperature 4 degrees below November average. Soil did not warm this summer. Depth of cold will be greater than last year. Duration unknown. Prepare for longer. She closed the journal. It went back on the shelf above the window. She made her coffee. Standing at the window, cup in both hands, she watched the valley wake up to its first white morning of the season. Smoke began to rise from chimneys. The Doyle place, the Marsh property, the Hester farm on the North Ridge. Thin columns climbed straight up into still air. It meant no wind. It meant temperatures cold enough to make the chimneys draw cleanly. The valley adjusted. It always adjusted. People used wood fires. They had the practical competence of those who had done this before. Across the valley, in a farmhouse, Clara could not see but knew well. Thomas Hale spoke to his wife, Margaret. He told her winter had begun. He said it would end, like all winters, by March or so. They had enough stores. Enough wood. Nothing to worry about, he said, beyond the usual work of staying warm and waiting. He truly believed this. He had believed it for 17 previous winters. He had been right 17 times. That kind of record makes belief feel like knowledge. It makes the difference seem unimportant, but the distinction is never irrelevant. It is simply quiet until the moment it becomes everything. December arrived in the Bitterroot Valley. It came with the certainty of something that had done this before. It expected no argument. The snow that fell in November stayed. Day after day, it compacted under its own weight. It became that solid white that no longer looked like weather. It looked like geography. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees Celsius by the second week of the month. It stayed there. The valley adjusted. It had adjusted to this every December before. People brought in more wood. They wore more layers. They traveled less. They stayed outside for shorter times. They went about the business of winter. It was routine. Clara adjusted nothing. That was the distinction. Nobody watched closely enough to notice. She did not react to December. She had not waited for December to tell her what to do. Everything December needed from her had been decided. It had been built. It had been sealed into the floor before October ended. The cellar ran at 4 degrees Celsius. The hatch held. She opened it every third day. It was a schedule she kept in her head, not in the journal. Some disciplines do not need to be written down. They just need to be practiced. They become the way the body moves through time. Each inspection took 20 minutes. She went down with a candle. She moved through the sections in the same order. She checked the same contact points between wood and earth. She pressed her knuckles against the straw insulation to make sure it still held its loft. She turned each hanging crock a quarter rotation. This kept any single seam from bearing too much pressure. She checked the lower crates for the specific smell of decay, a sweetish, slightly fermented quality. It hides under the normal cellar smell of cold earth and dried plants. She found nothing that worried her. Everything she had put down there remained what she had put down there. This was the only result she had been building toward. She kept the cabin fire at a consistent level. Not high, not banked low, consistent. Consistent heat meant consistent moisture in the air above. This meant consistent behavior from the planking overhead. No expansion, no contraction, no stress on the sand layer between the floorboards. She burned oak when she had it, ash when she did not. She stayed away from poplar. It burned fast. It threw sparks. She did not trust it in a single-room cabin with only one exit. She had 4 cords of wood stacked against the east wall of her property. They were covered in canvas. She kept account of what she used, the same way she kept count of what she ate, not obsessively, but consistently. Discipline produces useful information. Obsession produces only anxiety. Christmas passed without ceremony. She was not a woman who needed ceremony to mark time. She ate a meal slightly better than her daily ones, a piece of dried pork she had saved. Some preserved carrots cooked with a small amount of rendered fat, a portion of dried apples she had put up in August. She sat by the window in the early dark of the winter solstice. She watched the absolute stillness of the valley at night. The deep cold. It was one of the particular beauties of a Montana December. You did not need to be warm to appreciate it, but it was considerably easier when you were. January arrived, and with it a cold that did not just settle in, it stayed. This was the first thing that truly mattered. People in the valley expected cold in January. Montana winters were known for it, but what they had not planned for was a cold without variation. Normal winters had a rhythm. There were cold weeks, then slightly less cold weeks. Those small breaks made the sustained cold bearable. The January of 1892 offered no such rhythm. The temperature held in the same narrow band day after day with an unmoving consistency. It was as if the winter had made a decision and would not change its mind. Clara noticed it. She wrote in her journal each morning. The soil reading never changed. The air temperature stayed the same. The sky remained that pale, iron blue color. It was the color of a weather system that sat still rather than moving on. Movement was what ended weather. Stillness was what made it last. Clara kept to her routine. She did not change anything she was doing. She did not take more food from her cellar. She did not burn more wood. Her inspection schedule for the cabin and the cellar remained the same. It was tempting to do something, to make an adjustment, to feel like these new conditions demanded a new response. But Clara had learned that this urge was mostly the mind's discomfort with waiting. It was not a real need for change in her body. Her body was warm. Her food was secure. The right way to respond to conditions that had not actually changed her situation was to keep doing what worked. This took a discipline that looked like doing nothing from the outside, but it was its own kind of active decision. Across the valley, people were burning more wood. They were burning more than they thought they would by this time of year. It was only a little more, not enough to cause alarm yet, but it was more. The constant cold was pulling heat from their homes faster than in the last 2 winters. The firewood plans people had made back in October were starting to show small differences between what they expected and what they were actually using. Thomas Hale cut and split an extra half cord of timber. He took it from the trees on his north edge during the second week of January. He worked for 2 days in temperatures that made the job harder than it would have been in November. He was not worried. He was being careful. And being careful in this valley looked exactly like what he was doing. Then, the Marsh boy went to Hamilton. James Marsh was 19. He was strong. He had lived through worse conditions than a winter day's walk in a valley he had known his whole life. The trip itself made sense. They needed lamp oil. It was the kind the general store in Hamilton carried, the kind they could not make at home. 13 kilometers each way, a full day's journey. It was nothing a healthy young man had not done in winter before. He left in the morning. The temperature was minus 11 degrees Celsius. The sky showed no sign of getting worse. His father watched him go. Raymond Marsh did not think much of it. There was nothing out of the ordinary to think. James did not come back that evening. Raymond Marsh waited until dark. Then he waited another hour. He took a lantern and walked down the trail toward Hamilton. He called his son's name into the empty cold. The lantern found James 3 kilometers from home. He was lying on his side in the snow at the edge of the trail. He had simply stopped being able to go on. James was conscious. That was the first thing Raymond checked. He put his hands on his son's face. He held the lantern close, conscious, but he could not stand without help. He could not explain why, except that his feet had stopped working right somewhere around the 10-kilometer mark. He had pushed on for 3 more kilometers before the damage spoke to his body. It spoke not as pain, but as failure. Raymond got him home. Deborah Marsh took his boots off. The situation became clear. The damage to the 2 smallest toes on his left foot was already certain. It was not life-threatening. It was not the kind of thing that would permanently end a young man's future, but it was wrong. It was wrong in the specific way things go wrong when conditions that seemed manageable were actually much closer to the edge than anyone realized. The line between a hard but survivable winter walk and a dangerous one had been thinner than James Marsh had known. This January, with its unyielding consistency, was colder than its daily numbers let on. And consistency affects a body differently than intensity does. Clara heard about James Marsh from Eleanor Doyle. Eleanor stopped at Clara's cabin on her way back from checking on Deborah. Eleanor was shaken. She was like someone who had just seen proof that the world they thought they were living in was not the world they were actually in. Her oldest child was 11. Her youngest was 4. She stood at Clara's door in her heavy coat. She said she did not want to make too much of it. James would be fine. It was just bad luck. Poor planning on a cold day. Then she stopped talking. She looked at Clara. Something was shifting behind her eyes, something that was searching for the right word for the feeling, but could not quite find it. He miscalculated the cost, Clara told her. Not the distance, the cost. Eleanor Doyle went home. Clara closed her door. She stood in her cabin for a moment, not moving. She looked at nothing in particular. She thought about the invisible margin that had caught James Marsh. It was invisible to him right up until the moment it took him. That was the nature of margins. They were invisible until they were not. By the time they became visible, they had already made their decision about you. She went to the window. The valley lay quiet under its blanket of white. Thomas Hale's smoke rose straight up from his chimney. It was a thin line in the still air, the Doyle property. Further on, the Marsh place. All of them burning their wood, using their stores, moving through their winter the way they had moved through previous winters. They made adjustments that seemed right. They assumed the framework they were working within was the same framework it had always been. The framework was not the same. February brought a cold that never let up. It wasn't just winter anymore. It felt like a permanent fixture. The snow fell twice, adding another 15 centimeters. But the cold didn't break. Instead, it settled in deeper, making itself at home. Across the valley, wood supplies became a daily worry for most families. Thomas Hale had to burn through his emergency pile and started watching his main stack with new eyes. The Doyle family began letting their fire die down at night, leaving their cabin to cool, and their children often woke up shivering. By the 3rd week of February, the Doyles decided it was time to go. It wasn't a panic choice, but a practical one. They had a cousin in Hamilton, 24 kilometers south, with a bigger house and plenty of supplies. The road, though snow-covered, was still clear enough for a horse-drawn sled. The weather had settled into a steady cold, no active storms in sight. Staying felt like a worse gamble. They had already used up too much, and their stores wouldn't last forever. They talked it over for 2 days. Then they loaded what they could onto their sled. They left their animals with the Hester brothers, promising to return the favor in the spring. The morning they left was clear, minus 13 degrees Celsius. It felt like a day when anything was possible. The Marsh family had been having the same hard talks. When they heard the Doyles were leaving, Raymond and Deborah decided to join them. But there was the matter of James. His foot was healing, but that was a relative term in February. His toes were gone, and the remaining tissue was still very sensitive to the cold. The journey by sled would be hard for him. James made the choice himself. Young men often do when the only other option is to be carried. He said he would stay. He had enough food, he insisted. He would be fine. The cabin was strong, and there was still plenty of wood. When the weather got better, he would make his own way to Hamilton or wait for his parents to come back. Deborah Marsh cried. Raymond Marsh shook his son's hand. He couldn't bring himself to hug James in a way the boy would accept. Then they climbed onto the Doyle sled. The two families left together, heading for Hamilton in the February cold. Clara stood at her window. She heard the sled as it passed on the valley road. She watched it until it disappeared behind the pine trees that blocked the view to the south. Then she looked across the valley at the Hale property. Thomas was outside, watching the same thing. He raised a hand toward the departing sled. The gesture was returned. He went back inside. Clara turned from her window. She looked down at the sealed hatch in her cabin floor. She thought about the sky she had checked before sunrise that morning. The air was still. High pressure held everything in place. No storm was coming, and that was good news. But the horizon to the northwest had a strange quality in the first light, a flatness in the color. It made her think the weather system overhead was deep, not shallow. That what sat over the valley wasn't just a quick cold snap, but a layer of cold with real weight and a long stay ahead. She didn't know what had happened to the Doyle and Marsh families on their road to Hamilton. Not yet. That kind of information always comes later. It comes too late to change what has already been decided, but it comes at exactly the right time to change how you understand it. Thomas Hale came to her door at the end of February. He was still on horseback, which meant he wasn't at his most desperate point yet. But the horse moved differently than it had in August or September. Slower. It had that particular reluctance of an animal being asked to work in the cold without enough food. Thomas himself looked like a man who had spent many nights running numbers in his head and coming up with the same answer. An answer that wasn't the one he planned for. He came inside. He didn't sit down. That was information in itself. A man who sits has time. A man who stands has an errand. Margaret and I need another month, he said. His voice was steady, not ashamed, not demanding. Just stating the facts, like a man does when he has already used up all the softer options inside his head. I can pay you in timber. I have 2 cords of cut ash on the north edge. Seasoned. Yours if you want them. Clara looked at him for a moment. 2 people, 1 month, late winter diet, 27 kilograms of mixed stores, a rough guess, depending on what they still had. She walked to the hatch. She lifted the second plank, then she pulled open the fitted pine cover. Cool air rose out of the dark below. It had that particular quality, unchanged since September. It was indifferent to the 4 months of winter that had passed above it. She went down the ladder. She didn't ask him to wait. She just went. From the eastern section, she took 2 medium-sized crates of mixed-root vegetables, 1 jar of dried corn, a cloth-wrapped piece of dried pork. She brought them up one at a time. She set them on the cabin floor next to the open hatch. She came up the second time. She lifted the hatch cover. She fitted it back into its frame. Then she replaced the second plank. Thomas was looking at the crates. Then he looked at her. You still have a lot down there. Yes. How much? She told him the number she had in her head. It wasn't the number from her last formal count. It was the number she carried forward from that count, adjusted by 33 days of her usual consumption. She could do this math the way someone reads a clock, not by calculating, but by knowing. Enough, she said. He heard the word differently than he had in August. In August, it had sounded like she was avoiding the question. Now, it sounded like a precise claim with a precise meaning. And that meaning was not comfortable. Enough for you, he said. Not just generally. Enough for me, and some beyond that. I know exactly where the line is between the some beyond and the part that is not available. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up a little. It was the first wind in days. Clara noticed it without turning to look. Wind in February in that valley, after a long stretch of still cold, sometimes meant the weather was starting to move. That could be the start of a change. Or it could mean nothing. She would know in 3 days if it was the beginning of something, or just a windy day. Thomas picked up one of the crates. I didn't think it would last this long, he said. It wasn't an apology. It was an observation, offered with the honesty of a man who understood now that his observation was part of why he was standing in someone else's cabin holding a crate of their food. Clara looked at him. The winter doesn't go as long as you think it will. It goes as long as it goes. He carried the crates to the door. He came back for the cloth-wrapped pork. At the door, he paused. The thing that crossed his face was not quite gratitude. It was not quite humility either. It was the look of a man who had just put himself on the other side of an exchange he had spent 4 months believing he would never need to make. He nodded. Then he left. April arrived, and with it, the valley's confidence began to crack. It wasn't loud, not all at once. It happened like ice breaking from under a frozen river, unseen, where the pressure had built for too long. One day, people still said winter would end soon. A week later, they said it with less conviction. Then, they stopped predicting altogether. They started counting. Counting is what communities do when they stop expecting relief. They start managing what they have. Inventory management. That is a different way of thinking than just riding out bad weather. Clara had been managing inventory since August. For everyone else, this was new. And its newness showed. Families who had kept to themselves all winter started showing up at each other's doors. Not for visiting, for information. How much wood was left? How much food? How long could they last? The questions were practical. This meant the situation had moved past being an inconvenience. It was a problem now. Everyone knew it. The pretense that it wasn't was over. Then Thomas came. He brought news. He had met the supply man at the valley's edge. This man ran trade goods between the outlying properties and Hamilton, the town. Thomas had asked about the Doyles. The supply man took a moment to organize his answer. In that pause, Thomas knew. The answer wouldn't be simple. The Doyle family had reached Hamilton, all 5 of them. That was the main thing. That was what mattered most. But the youngest child, Ruth, she was 4 years old. She arrived with frostbite on both feet. It was bad enough to take 3 toes from her right foot. She hadn't cried on the journey. That's why no one knew how bad it was. She had been wrapped, bundled, accounted for, and the cold had done its work. It found a small body, still too long in temperatures small bodies cannot handle like larger ones can. The Doyles were in Hamilton. They were still a family. Ruth would walk without those toes, eventually. Eleanor Doyle had not left her daughter's side since they got there. The Marsh family, Raymond and Deborah, they also made it to Hamilton. Their son, James, had not come with them. He had stayed in the cabin, Raymond told the supply man. Because of his foot, he had insisted. No one went back to check on him. No one could get back to check on him. The last Raymond Marsh heard of his son was a handshake at the door back in February. Thomas told Clara all this that afternoon. He delivered the news in pieces. Each one sat down carefully. He watched her face for the moment she understood what the pieces added up to. Clara's face didn't show much. It registered the information. That was different. She looked at Thomas. What did he have in the cabin? James. Did Raymond say? Thomas didn't know. Raymond hadn't thought to check his son's supplies. Not at the moment of departure. Raymond was focused on getting his wife onto the sled. He needed to get the sled moving in the right direction. Clara walked to her window. She looked out at the valley. She did a calculation she had not made before. Until today, there had been no reason to make it. The Marsh cabin was 5 kilometers north. James had been alone there since the 3rd week of February. That was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks in a cabin. His family had already been using their supplies before they left. He was a young man. He had a frostbite injury. His movement would have been limited even on good days. What she calculated next was not a number. It was a line, the edge of what she could control and what she could not. She could not cross 5 kilometers of heavy snow, not to check on a young man who might not even be there. She could not make that trip and then make it back. She could not leave her cellar alone for that long. The Marsh cabin was within the distance her mind could reach, but it was outside the distance her body could responsibly travel. The difference between those 2 distances was a specific geography of helplessness. She stood at the window. She felt the weight of that geography. She did not pretend it was lighter than it was. Thomas was still there, still standing. He watched her. He looked like a man who had delivered bad news. Now he waited to see what the person who got it would do. Clara turned from the window. "Margaret," she said. "How is she?" His answer was slow. It was slower than it should have been if the answer were simple. Margaret had lost weight. He did not say how much, but the way he said it, Clara knew it was visible. Invisible weight loss on a woman of Margaret's age in winter meant something specific. It spoke to the caloric reality of the last months. She is managing. That was the phrase he used. He said it with a particular flatness. The flatness of a man who knows a phrase is doing more work than it should have to. Clara opened the hatch. She went down the ladder. In the south section, she counted what was left. She had a systematic way of doing this. She went through each category. She kept the running total in her head. She did not write it down. The number needed to be real in her mind first. It needed to be checked against months of use. Was it plausible? Only then would she write it down. She came back up. She had a number, 68 kilograms. It was spread across root vegetables, dried corn, dried pork, rendered fat, and other dry goods. She did the math for her own needs. 45 days at her usual rate of 0.9 kilograms a day. That was 41 kilograms for herself. She had set a minimum margin from the start, a floor she would not go below, 9 kilograms. That left 18 kilograms available. She did not offer 18 kilograms. The winter was not over yet. A second buffer, inside the first one, was not just being careful. It was the kind of math that had kept people alive in Minnesota winters before she was born. She would give 9 kilograms. For 2 people, Thomas and Margaret, at a reduced but sustainable rate. About 10 days. Thomas was still standing when she came up. She told him the number. He looked at her. 10 days is not a month. 10 days is what the arithmetic permits right now. She said it without apology. That was not the same as saying it without weight. The weight was there. She carried it. The math was still correct. If I give you more than this, and the winter lasts longer than I can predict, there is nobody left in this valley who can give you anything at all." He stood very still. It was the stillness of a man processing a truth shaped like a door swinging shut. 10 days, he said. 10 days. He carried the 2 crates she had prepared to the door. Then he came back. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at her with an expression. It was beyond August, beyond September, even beyond February, beyond the doubt and the worry and the reluctant thanks. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understands. He is alive right now because someone made a decision 7 months ago, a decision he called excessive. The size of that understanding was too big to fit into any words he could say at the door of a Montana cabin in April. So he nodded once. He left. That night, Clara opened her journal. She wrote the date at the top. Below it, the soil temperature from that morning. Then, the cellar inventory count. Below that, in smaller letters than she usually used, a single line. 10 days given. 18 kilograms held in reserve above margin. James Marsh. No information. Winter continues. She closed the journal. The fire burned at its usual level. The hatch in the floor was sealed. The cellar below held its temperature. It held the line. It did not care about April. It did not care about the calendar. It did not care about anything but the physical facts that governed it. Cold, stillness, and the depth where the earth stops caring what season is happening above it. Outside, the snow held, the sky held, the cold held, and somewhere 5 kilometers north, in a cabin no one had reached for 6 weeks, a question waited for its answer in the dark. The figure appeared at the southern edge of Clara's property. It was a Thursday morning, the first week of May. He moved through the snow with a particular gait. It was the movement of someone whose body had done one thing for a very long time. It had forgotten how to do anything else. Clara saw him from her window. She was making coffee, a dark shape against the white, moving slowly, not stopping. He was oriented toward her cabin with a single-minded focus, like a person who knew their destination. Now, they were simply closing the distance, no matter the cost. She watched him for a full minute. She wanted to understand what she was looking at. Only then would she respond. This was her practice for most things that arrived without announcement. The figure was male, young. His body telegraphed youth even through heavy clothing, even after months of hard living. Something in the ratio of movement to effort. The way his muscles compensated was different than an older body. He used a stick cut from a branch. It supported his left side. He bore weight differently on his 2 legs, favoring his right. She understood what that meant. She knew it before he reached the rail at the edge of her yard. The door was already open by the time he raised his hand to knock. James Marsh looked at her from the threshold. His eyes had the quality of someone recently returned from a great distance. Not miles. An interior kind of distance. The kind sustained conditions create when a person has been alone long enough. The presence of another human face required a moment of adjustment. He was thinner than she remembered from the previous autumn. That was expected. His color was acceptable. That was the important thing. His left boot was wrapped in an additional layer of cloth. It was tied over it. That was how a young man managed a healing foot injury in a winter cabin without medical attention. Clara stepped to the side. He came in. She did not speak immediately. Neither did he. This was its own kind of communication, a mutual understanding. What had just happened, him arriving at her door, standing there, was a complete fact. It needed no verbal acknowledgement to be real. She put the coffee on, set 2 cups on the table. She placed before him the bowl she had been heating on the stove. She had started it the moment she saw him crossing the field. Soup, potato, and dried corn. The kind she made from the cellar stores when she wanted something that would carry heat for a long time after it was consumed. He sat and ate. She let him eat. She did not convert the silence into something social. The silence was appropriate. Filling it would have been for her benefit, not his. When the bowl was empty, he held it for a moment. Then he set it on the table. He looked at her. "My parents," he said. His voice had the quality of something unused for speaking in some time. Rough at the edges, careful in the middle. They reached Hamilton. Clara poured the coffee. Both of them. "Your mother was worried. Your father was worried. They are the kind of worry that will end the moment they know what I know right now." He absorbed this without visible reaction. That told her he had been carrying the parallel worry for them through the same weeks they had been carrying it for him. The relief was happening somewhere below the surface. She was not meant to see it. He was 19. Experience had not yet given him permission to let relief show on his face, so he kept his face level. He drank his coffee. "How?" he said. One word. It was enough. Clara looked at him. "Tell me first. Then I will tell you what I think it means." He told her. There had been 19 kilograms of dried corn in a sack at the back of the storage room. His family had not taken it. They had not remembered it was there. It was a sack from the previous year's surplus, set back in the corner, behind the empty crates. One of those objects that become invisible through familiarity. He had found it on the third day after they left. He was looking for anything his family might have left behind. He had counted the ears that first night. He sat with the number for a long time before he decided what it meant. It meant he was not going to starve in the next 2 weeks. That was as far ahead as he allowed himself to plan from that point forward, 2 weeks at a time. Count what you have, determine what that amount covers, operate within that window, then count again. He had burned wood at a lower rate than his parents, partly because he ran a smaller fire, partly because he moved less. Moving less in a cold cabin is its own form of cold management. The body generates heat from effort. If effort is reduced, the fire has to compensate, but if the fire has to compensate for less, it lasts longer. He had understood this. He understood it the way a person understands something when the alternative to understanding it is dying from not understanding it. That is the most efficient pedagogy available. Clara listened. She did not interrupt. She did not take notes. But she noted everything. Not just the facts of what he had done. She noted the structure of the reasoning underneath those facts. He had not had the benefit of planning, or experience, or a father's accumulated winter knowledge distilled into childhood habit. What he had was the corn, and the problem, and the enforced solitude. Solitude in which to think about nothing else. From those materials, he had constructed, imperfectly, by necessity, a version of the same logic she had spent a summer building into a cellar. The logic is not complicated. The difficulty is never in the logic. The difficulty is in taking it seriously before the situation requires you to, which is the only time taking it seriously actually helps. You did the thing that mattered, she told him. You counted before you spent, not after. He looked at her with something not quite surprise, not quite recognition, the expression of someone hearing a principle articulated, a principle they had experienced as pure instinct. I did not have a choice. That is when most people learn it. She picked up his empty cup. She refilled it. The ones who learn it before they have to are rarer. They're the ones who can share it afterward. He stayed through the afternoon, warming by degrees. She gave him what she could in terms of food to carry back, not from the cellar, but from what she had in the cabin, the portion of daily stores that had not yet gone below. She gave him enough for 2 days of travel. It was more than he needed, less than generosity. That was the appropriate position for what remained of a winter that had not yet finished making its decisions. He thanked her, the way of a young man, not certain the word was adequate, knowing it was not, using it anyway because language does what it can. Then he wrapped his boot, picked up his stick, and set out north toward the Marsh property, where he would wait in his own cabin, until conditions allowed him to reach Hamilton and close the distance the winter had put between him and his parents. Clara stood at the window. She watched him until the pines took him. Then she went to her journal. She turned to that day's page. Below the morning soil temperature, she wrote, James Marsh, alive, self-sufficient, arrived this morning, departed north, corn sack and back storage, 18.6 kilograms. He counted it first. She underlined the last 4 words, not for emphasis, but because they were the specific fact that mattered. She wanted them separate from the surrounding ones. Then the wind did something different. Thomas came back on a morning when it shifted, not warmer, not yet, but it came from the southwest. That was the direction where warmth eventually arrived in that valley. It carried a quality Clara could not put into numbers, but her body registered it. It was like how the body knows certain things before the mind catches up. She was outside when she first felt it. She checked the snow depth against the fence post she used as a gauge. Still 79 centimeters on the level. That was significant. The wind moved across her face. She stood still for a moment, eyes closed. She simply noted it, filed it. She did not act on it. Thomas arrived an hour later. He moved across the field from the north. His movements showed the deliberate care of a man-rationing effort, along with everything else. He had come alone. Margaret had not been able to walk the distance comfortably. He did not say it in those words. His arrival without her explained it. He looked better than he had in April. He looked worse than he had in any prior year. The winter had taken a visible toll. It showed in his face. It showed in his posture. It showed in the way he stood in a doorway, as if he was not sure the floor and walls still worked the way they should. He told her before she could ask. The 10 days had not been enough. He had made it stretch to 12. He did it by reducing portions beyond what was comfortable. Those 2 extra days had cost Margaret more than the first 10. The last 2 days of a ration are not the same as the first 2. They come after the body has already been operating below its preferred threshold. The deficit builds up. It does not show immediately, but it shows eventually. Margaret was warm. She was inside. She was not in danger in the way danger has a specific definition. But she was at a point that needed correction. Clara had run her own daily count for the 10 days since Thomas had last been there. She carried the number forward each morning, the way she carried the soil temperature. As a fact to be known, not a decision to be made. She knew the current number without going to the cellar. 50 kilograms. That was the 59 kilograms she had kept after giving Thomas his 10 days, minus the 9 kilograms she herself had eaten since then. She did the math. Her own daily needs, forward to the end of what she considered a reasonable maximum window, 32 kilograms. That assumed another 35 days of winter. That was longer than any prior May in that valley had ever required. Her margin floor was 9 kilograms. Available was 9 kilograms. That was 8 to 9 days for 2 people at a sustainable rate. She did not tell Thomas the breakdown. She told him the result. 8 days. No more. His jaw tightened for a moment. Not against her, against the math. That is what a person tightens against when the math is closing in. Then he relaxed it. 8 days. He said it the way people say numbers when they convert them into time in their heads, stretching them against the shape of the days to come, testing whether the shape fits. That might be enough. It may be. She went to the hatch. Bring what wood you can move when the ground allows it. Not as payment, as balance. What goes between people in circumstances like this should not only go one way. He helped her bring the crates up. He had not done that before. Before, he had waited for her to do the work. He had received what she prepared. This shift to helping was its own sign. Something had changed in him, not just gratitude. Gratitude is a feeling. This was something more lasting than gratitude. He carried the crates to the door. He handled them with the care of a man who understood what he was carrying. That was different from the care of a man who was simply careful with someone else's property. At the door, he stopped. He turned back toward her. Clara. His voice had something in it she had not heard in all their visits since August. Not the skepticism, not the concern, not the reluctant gratitude. Something older. I have been thinking about what you said in September, about feeling good not being the same as being ready. She waited. I did not understand what you meant. I thought I did. But I understood it as an argument you were making, not as a description of a real thing. He shifted the crate in his hands. It is a real thing. Yes, you knew that before September. I knew it before Montana. He nodded. He went out into the May cold. He carried the 8 days of remaining margin. Clara closed the door. She stood in the quiet cabin. She did not feel vindicated. Vindication means being right was the point. The point had never been being right. The point was that when the margin was spent and the math was settled, Margaret Hale would still be alive. She would be warm again. That outcome was worth everything the summer had cost, and more. The 12th of May was a Tuesday. Clara stepped outside at her usual time. Before coffee, she went to take the soil temperature. She put the thermometer down into the pipe. She held it. She looked at the sky. She felt the thing she had felt the previous week, but stronger now, that quality in the air. Something had shifted in the architecture of the system overhead. Not the temperature at eye level, that was still cold. It was still fully winter in every practical sense. Something in the pressure, something in the way the light fell. She had no instrument for these things, no vocabulary precise enough to describe them. She only had 47 years of reading weather. She used the part of her brain that processes patterns before the conscious mind catches up. That part of her brain was sending a signal. It was different from the signal it had been sending since November. She pulled out the thermometer. She read it. Negative 0.5 degrees Celsius at 46 centimeters, down 1 from yesterday. That was within normal variation. It meant nothing by itself. She went inside. She made her coffee. She built the fire to its standard level, not above it. She ate her standard morning portion from the daily stores. She opened her journal to the day's page. She wrote the soil reading. Below it, she wrote May 12th. Something changed overnight. Direction of air shifted southwest. Pressure quality different. Not acting on it yet. She underlined the last 5 words. She closed the book. Thomas came that afternoon. Not for food. Not with need. He came the way a person comes when they are restless inside a situation. Movement is the only form of agency available to them. He stood outside. He did not come in. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked at the sky, the way people look at skies during long winters, searching for evidence of something that might be there. "It feels different today," he said when she came to the door. "Yes." He turned and looked at her. "You are not doing anything differently." "No. It is warmer." There was a beat, marginally. 2 degrees at noon. She had checked the air thermometer at midday. She did not usually do that. 2 degrees is a change in measurement. I need a change in pattern. He worked his hands inside his pockets. How long? 7 days of consistent change is a pattern. 1 day is a day. He looked back at the sky. After everything, you were still waiting. Clara held the doorframe with one hand. She thought about the best way to say what needed to be said. It was not a rhetorical point. It was a practical one. It had governed every decision she had made since the previous August. The cost of acting too early on a false signal is exactly as real as the cost of acting too late, and the only defense against both errors is patience applied to evidence rather than to hope. In 1887, there was a warm day in late April, she told him, 3 degrees Celsius, sunshine. Half the snow was gone from the south-facing slopes in 2 days. Robert Hester, the brother's father before your time here, opened his stores completely. He had a meal for his family that night. He called it the spring celebration. She paused. 4 days later, the temperature dropped back to negative 8 degrees Celsius. It stayed there for 3 more weeks. He had eaten through his margin on a Tuesday in April. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard between them, from the southwest, carrying its changed quality. 7 days, he said. 7 days. He went home. Clara went inside. She maintained her schedule exactly as she had maintained it for the previous 186 days. Discipline applied only when it is comfortable is not discipline. It is preference. The 13th of May was 1 degree Celsius warmer than the 12th. The next day, the 14th, it was 2 degrees Celsius warmer still. Clara wrote each reading in her journal, just the date and the number. Nothing else. The numbers held the information, and that information needed to stay clean without any interpretation until interpretation had been earned. On the 15th, the temperature held steady. It did not go up. This was not a problem, but it was not the steady climb she waited for. She kept to her normal tasks. The 16th brought another degree of warmth, and something new, something visible. The snow on the south-facing side of the cabin's roof had begun to sag inward just a little. This was the first real sign that melting had started. Not just a soft surface, but water moving underneath the snow where the sun hit longest. She saw it. She wrote it down. She did nothing else. On the 17th, she heard the first drip. It came from the eaves, right over the east window. A single drop of meltwater. It hit the frozen ground below with a sound small enough to ignore. But she had been listening for it. She heard it clearly from across the room. She walked to the window. She looked up at the eaves. Another drop fell. Then a pause, 30 seconds long. Then another. The time between drops grew shorter through the morning. The sun climbed higher. Heat built up on the dark roof. By midday, a thin, steady stream of water fell from the eaves. The sound of it was the first sound all winter that was not wind or falling snow or the heavy, quiet cold. She did not open her stores. She did not build the fire higher. She watched the drip. She wrote it in her journal. She continued with her day. The 18th brought the first visible path through the snow. Not a cleared trail, not an open patch of ground, just a slight dip on the south-facing slope of the yard. The snow there had gotten thin. The dark earth underneath was starting to take in more of the sun's heat than the snow above it could reflect away. It was a narrow strip about 20 centimeters wide. It ran along the fence line where the posts had been gathering and holding warmth for months. The earth itself was not showing yet, but its presence was hinted at through the surface in a way it had not been since October. On the 19th, the soil pipe read 0.5 degrees Celsius at 45 centimeters deep. That was 1 degree Celsius up from the last reading. 1 degree Celsius of soil warming. After months of staying within a single-degree band, this was the kind of change that meant something deep down had shifted. Not the air, which changes fast and means little. The soil. That changes slowly. And it means everything. Clara went inside. She opened the journal. She wrote the number. Below it, she wrote, Day 7. Pattern confirmed. Soil moving, melt accelerating, conditions consistent with transition. Then she closed the journal. For the first time since October, she built the fire higher than just keeping it going. Not a big blaze, just one extra piece of ash wood. Enough to raise the cabin's temperature by 2 degrees Celsius for the afternoon. She stood by the stove. She let the extra heat fill the room. It felt like something she had not let herself feel since November. Not exactly pleasure, but close enough to matter. That evening, she went to the cellar. She carried the candle down the ladder. She moved through the sections one last time. She had done this every third day since September. But tonight, the movement felt different. It was not an inspection. It was an acknowledgement. She had built this space for a reason. The reason had been met. The work was done. It was complete in the way things are complete when they have been tested by the exact conditions they were made to withstand. She ran her hand along the northwest corner. She had packed the clay there in March. It was dry. It had held. She looked at the food left. 10 kilograms, the last of the root vegetables, a partial pot of rendered fat. She looked at them the way a person looks at something that did its job, with a respect that had nothing to do with feeling. She climbed back up through the hatch. She stood in the cabin. She pressed the cover back into its frame. She left it unsealed. This was the first time since October. The cellar needed to start getting used to the changing temperatures. Controlling the rate of change was as important now, at the end, as it had been at the beginning. Thomas came on the 23rd. He brought Margaret. This was the first time Margaret Hale had been to Clara's cabin. It was the first time Clara had seen her since before winter began. The change in Margaret was clear. It was the kind of change a Montana winter takes from a woman who faced it without enough preparation. Margaret stood upright. She walked. She was present, like someone who had come through something hard and knew it. But she had not yet decided how she felt about that knowing. She was thinner than before. Her face held a careful, quiet look. It was the look of people who spend months saving every bit of energy, even their feelings. She looked at the cabin, at the floor. Then she looked straight at Clara. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. They carried the heavy weight of a woman who chose her words carefully, a woman who had held those 2 words inside for a long time. Clara looked back at her. "You held through the hardest part. We had help holding," Margaret said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "I want to know how you knew." Clara thought about the question. It was not about how she prepared, or how she planned, or how the cellar worked. It was about where her knowledge came from, how it traveled through time. She thought about her father, standing at a grave in the frozen Minnesota ground. It was mid-April. He said something about calendars and winters. She thought about carrying that sentence forward. 30 years, 1 husband's death. 7 years of making every decision alone in a land that was beautiful, cold, and did not care about her plans. "I learned from someone who learned it the hard way," Clara said. "And I learned it before I had to." Margaret nodded slowly. It was the nod of a woman writing something down in a permanent file. Thomas stood by his wife. He looked at the floor, at the hatch. Then he looked at Clara. His expression had been building since February. It had taken months to form because it needed him to let go of something first. It was the look of a man who had changed a core belief. Not unwillingly, not completely, but enough to change what came next. "I called it excessive," he said. The words came out flat. "Plain. You did. I was wrong about the word. The word depends on what you are measuring against. Clara walked to the stove. She brought the coffee pot to the table, 3 cups. Against a normal winter, 225 kilograms for one person is excessive. Against a winter that does not end, it is exactly enough. The word changes with the denominator. He sat down at the table. He had never done that before. Margaret sat beside him. The 3 of them sat in Clara's cabin. The late May warmth filled the room, growing a little stronger each day. 7 days of consistent warmth. Confirmed. They drank their coffee without rushing. That stillness, that lack of urgency, was its own proof. It showed that something fundamental had changed in the season. The snow on the valley floor began to melt for real in the last week of May. It was not a sudden rush, not a dramatic thaw. This was the slow, steady retreat of a season that had been long and heavy. Its departure was measured in days, not just hours. Each morning, the narrow path along the fence line grew a little wider. Each afternoon, the drip from the cabin eaves lasted longer. The soil temperature, at 45 centimeters down, crept up a degree every 2 or 3 days. This was the pace of a true seasonal change, not just a temporary warmth. Clara watched it all. She reduced her fire incrementally as the air warmed. She matched her output to the conditions outside. She saved the wood she had left, not because she was low, but because saving was still the right thing to do. Not until the season fully declared itself. She opened the cellar hatch every morning. Now, it was not to count what was left. It was to let air move through. She equalized the temperature between the dark space below and the warming air above. This kept the spring moisture from condensing on her stored food. She built the cellar for winter. Now she managed its careful shift into spring. That needed its own kind of attention. The families came back to the valley in the first week of June. The Doyles arrived in a wagon, driven by Eleanor's cousin from Hamilton. Robert Doyle stepped down into his yard. He looked at his property. It was both completely familiar and a little strange, the way places become after you have been away. Eleanor carried Ruth, their youngest, down from the wagon. The child stood on the ground and walked toward the door. Her steps were different now. Her balance shifted from before February. She went inside. The Marsh family arrived 2 days later. Deborah Marsh climbed down from the wagon seat before it even stopped moving. She crossed the yard. Her son, James, did not pull away when she hugged him. Raymond shook James's hand. Then he put his other arm around him and just held it there. The 3 of them stood in the yard. James had kept that property through 4 months alone. There was nothing in that moment that needed words. Clara watched the reunion from the edge of her own land. She kept a respectful distance. This was not her moment. She did not need it to be. Through June, the valley slowly put itself back together. It was like damaged things do. Imperfectly. Deliberately. With a new seriousness, people had stopped taking the ordinary parts of their lives for granted. Fences were fixed. Fields were planted later than usual. Everyone understood the growing season was shorter now. People worked with different faces than they had worn the autumn before. Not exactly grimmer, but sharper. They knew which details truly mattered. They came to Clara one at a time or in pairs. They wanted to see the hatch in her floor. They asked about its depth, about insulation, about timing. She answered every question. Precisely. Briefly. Precision was more helpful than a long explanation. And the people asking had earned the real answers. They did not need softened versions. One afternoon, Robert Doyle stood at the open hatch. He looked down into the cellar. It was empty now, aired out. Its stores were all gone, right to the last bit. He asked her how deep. 2.4 meters, she told him. He asked why 2.4. She told him about the frost line, about the water table, and about the math between those two things. He nodded. He looked at the dark space. It does not look like a decision, he said. It looks like an answer. Clara thought about that. It is an answer, she said, to a question most people do not ask until they have to. He said he would dig one that summer, before anything else, before new animals, before the expanded field, this first. She told him she would help him figure out the right depth for his property's soil. His land sat differently than hers on the east side of the valley. He thanked her and left. Clara closed the hatch. She wrote in her journal. The date. 1 line. Doyle building a cellar, starting with the right question. Thomas Hale spent 2 days in July digging a cellar under his own barn. Raymond Marsh helped him. They set the measurements for the frost line on the north-facing slope of Thomas's property. He went 2.1 meters down before his shovel hit a layer of hard gravel. He could not go deeper without more equipment than he had. He came to Clara and told her about the gravel. She walked to his property. She looked at the opening. She pressed her hand against the gravel layer. She thought about it, the way she thought about problems that had more than one right answer. 2.1 meters is fine, she told him. You will need more insulation on the north wall. Double the rye straw. And face the storage crates inward. She showed him how to change the framing. This would keep the temperature steady, even with the shallower depth. He wrote it all down in a small notebook. He had apparently started carrying it since May. Clara noticed. She said nothing. He finished the cellar on a Friday afternoon in the third week of July. He stood at the opening and looked down into the dark. Then he looked at Clara. She had come to inspect the finished work, just as he had asked. She climbed down. She moved through the space. She checked the joints in the insulation. She checked the floor. Then she climbed back up. You left room between the frames, she said. You said air circulation matters more than people think. It does, he said. He looked at the open hatch in the barn floor. His expression was one Clara knew. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, something quieter than both. It was the look of a man who had built something that would work long after he was done building it. Something that would keep going while he did other things. It had its own logic. It would keep working even when he was not thinking about it. It was the look of a man who finally understood what it meant to build for a long time, not just for what he needed right now. We thought winter was something we understood, he said. His voice sounded like he was thinking out loud, not talking to her. Clara looked at him. You understood what it had been. He turned. He looked across his property, at the fields, now clear, at the barn, at the fences being fixed on the eastern boundary. The long winter's freezing and thawing had shifted the post there. Then he looked back at her. And you, he asked. What did you understand? She thought about the mercury thermometer, the iron pipe. On August mornings, she thought about the notebook with 6 years of soil readings. What 6 years of numbers looked like when one summer's numbers did not fit the pattern. She thought about her father's voice. At a neighbor's grave. In April? In Minnesota. Stripped of everything except accuracy. I understood what it could become, she said. Not would. Could. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. It was not the dismissive nod from August. Not the reluctant nod from February. This was the nod of a man putting something into a permanent place. That is the difference, he said. Yes. Not resources, not strength, not even effort. No. He closed his notebook. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked at the open hatch one last time. At the dark below it. At the cool air rising from the finished space. In a matter of weeks, it would hold the food that would get his family through whatever the next winter decided to be. Empty now. Patient. Waiting for the work that would fill it. That work would begin when it could. Not before. Because the discipline of filling it was as important as the discipline of everything else. It was not optional. It was not a matter of mood. Clara left Thomas at his completed cellar. She walked back across the valley to her own property. It was a late July afternoon. The light was long and warm, the way July light is in that valley. Grass grew back in the fields. The fence lines of the recovered properties ran clean across the land. She went inside. She made her coffee. She opened the journal to the day's page. She wrote the date. The air temperature. The soil reading she had taken that morning. Then, below those numbers, in the same small, careful handwriting she had used since 1885, she wrote, the 21st of July, 1892. Thomas Hale's cellar complete, 2.1 meters adjusted insulation, correct framing. He understands the question now. She paused, her pencil above the page. Then she added a final line. Began purchasing stores for next winter today. August is 3 weeks away. She closed the journal and put it back in its place. She stood at the window in the July evening. She looked at the valley she had lived in for 13 years. It was the same valley, and it was not the same valley. The difference between those two true things was the length of one winter, and what people chose to do with what that winter had taught them. Some of what it taught them they would carry for a season. Then the ordinary routines of a good year would soften it away. Some of what it taught them went deeper, into the bone, into habit, into the kind of knowledge that does not need remembering because it has become the shape of how a person moves through time. She turned from the window. The cellar hatch was in the floor, empty, waiting. The summer was not over yet. She went to work. The August heat once pressed down on Bitterroot Valley like a hand flat against the back of the neck. Now, the valley hums with a different kind of preparation. If understanding what something could become, not just what it would, is a lesson you want to carry forward, subscribe. And tell me, what is one lesson you learned the hard way that you now understand differently?